Welcome. My guest is Dr. Jeffrey B. Perry, an independent working class scholar formerly educated at Princeton, Harvard, Rutgers, and Columbia University. Dr. Perry's work focuses on the role of white supremacy as a retardant to progressive social change and on the centrality of struggle against white supremacy to progressive social change. For over 35 years, he has been active in the working class movement as a rank and file worker and as a union shop steward, officer, editor, and retiree. He has also been involved in domestic and international social justice issues, including affirmative action, union democracy, and anti-apartheid, anti-war, and anti-imperialist work. Perry was influenced towards serious study of matters of race and class in America through personal experiences and readings through the work of an independent scholar and close personal friend, the late Theodore William Allen, author of The Invention of the White Race, Volumes 1 and 2, and a new edition in 2012. Allen was an anti-white supremacist proletarian intellectual whose research and writings on the role of white supremacy in the United States history and on the centrality of struggle against white supremacy deposed Perry to be receptive to the life and work of Hubert H. Harrison, another independent self-taught anti-white supremacist working class intellectual. Thank you for being here, Dr. Perry.
Thank you so much, Gary.
Again, your work focuses on the role of white supremacy as a retardant to progressive social change and the centrality of struggle against white supremacy to progressive social change. Could you break this down for those that may not have a clear understanding of your objective?
Sure, in several ways. One, I'll use an example from Hubert Harrison, and then I'll use an example from Theodore W. Allen. Hubert Harrison, who's known as the father of Harlem radicalism, about 100 years ago, in late 1911, wrote that, using the terminology of the day, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. And a touchstone metaphor is an extraordinary metaphor because a touchstone is a stone you rub against a metal to see if it's really gold or not. And I think that metaphor can be used in assessing how we're doing in every issue we address, whether it's housing, education, healthcare, etc. We should put it to the test. How are Black people faring, and what are we going to do about it? It's just a good guide for keeping our antennas up and keeping our focus clear on what real progress is. He went on in that same statement to say, and this was in 1911 again, that true democracy and equality for the Negro implies a revolution startling to even think of. I think that quote foreshadowed the 1960s, the era that I grew up in which the civil rights and Black liberation struggle, which hit directly at white supremacy, served as a catalyst for all the other progressive movements of the era, the anti-war movement, the student movement, the women's movement, et cetera, et cetera. And it served as a catalyst because, of course, there were many heroic examples, but it was also hitting at the nature of how social control is maintained in this country. That's one aspect that I draw from Harrison. From Allen, when I first met Allen in the late 60s, early 70s, he was delivering a lecture in which he developed the theme that in three previous crises, and I say that with the full understanding that I think this current situation, the economic situation, and the critical nature of it is deepening. I don't think it's going to get better for a while. And but if we look back at the last three major crises in U.S. history, in the 1870s, in the 1890s, and then in the 1930s, what Allen argues convincingly in some of his writings is that in each and every crisis, when poor people, working people started to come together to push for change because conditions were so oppressive, that in each case, the ruling class turned to white supremacy to beat back those efforts from below. I'll give just the example of the most recent one of the Depression, and then I'll come back to sum up in answer to your question. In the Depression, today we'll oftentimes hear, well, what we need is a jobs program. We need an FDR type jobs program. Not quite. What actually happened in the Depression, and as a historian at Columbia University, Ira Katznelson has written an instructive book on this, When Affirmative Action Was White. But what happened in the Depression And from the 1930s into the 1960s, as Katz Nelson explains, each and every federal program was shaped in a white supremacist fashion. So if we look at the labor legislation of the New Deal, the National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, even Social Security until 1951, they excluded certain key groups, domestic and agricultural workers. And that was 60% of the African American workforce, 70% down south. Similarly, if we look at something like the GI Bill, and I'm in the New York area, and the GI Bill, families could get homeowner loans, a zero down payment, low interest loan. The statistics for New York, Northern New Jersey are of 67,000 GI loans that were awarded, less than 100 went to families of color. This is how the white suburbs get built. Perhaps the key statistic to look at is that at the start of the Depression in 1929, the black to white unemployment ratio was 1 to 1, which, if you think about it, makes sense since black people were traditionally and historically brought here as laborers, right? But by 1947, after World War II, and all those programs of the New Deal, right, all the jobs programs, the black to white unemployment ratio was roughly 2 to 1, which is what it's been as long as you and I have been alive, or at least grown, right? And that's what we're all familiar with, some variant of that 2 to 1. And that, so my point is, this is all done through conscious government policies, right? So, summing up from both Harrison on how the potential impact of genuine struggles against white supremacy and how they can really be invigorating and ennobling for people at the bottom of society, and Allen's analysis that as we've struggled in the past, what the ruling class has turned to beat us back has been white supremacy. I draw from both those sources to really emphasize that I think that in current struggles, every issue we look at, we have to look at how white supremacy is shaping it. We have to try and address that. We have to challenge that. And that is really the key to moving forward.
As previously stated, Dr. Allen was a close personal friend of yours who played a significant role in your development, not only as a man, but as an author. What would you say was the most fascinating aspect of his personality?
Well, there are several that I'll just mention briefly. He was humble. He's a former coal miner, and he's just a working class person. And I say that with much affection, right? Both Harrison and Allen referred to the common people, if you will, with much affection. Both were working class scholars. They lived in poverty. Harrison lived up on 134th Street, and it was the most densely populated block in Harlem when he lived there. Allen lived down on Brooklyn Avenue in Brooklyn for his last 50 years. So they lived amongst the people. And so Allen was humble, but as an intellectual, and again, both of them had this, but in addressing Allen, he had great integrity as an intellectual, and that's why I think his research and his writings are so valuable. He addresses crucial questions in our own history, but even as you go through his book, for instance, the 2 volumes of The Invention of the White Race, you will see that he knows the arguments that people might raise, the questions people might have, and throughout the book, he will bring them up to the fore and hold them up, present them in their best light, and then try to address them. So I really appreciate the intellectual integrity of Allen. It's also manifest in his thorough documentation. Here was a guy who spent 25, 30 years going through 17th century records in Virginia, which is where he went to all these county courthouses and county buildings to look at the documents from the 1600s where laboring people like you or I could go and have a voice, right? You know, in the hearings, in the proceedings. And he'd come back and he would transcribe this, and then he would type it up for his notes. You know, this is the pre-computer age. He's beginning this work. And so that's another aspect of Allen's intellectual work that really struck me. His humbleness, his intellectual integrity, and his keen analytical powers. I mean, you know, I saw him many times, and particularly when I was young, and I'd look to see how he handled contrary fact or a contrary opinion. And he was very well, he reasoned very well, he'd think things through, but he was very clear. And I think he was onto something when he understood and argued that what is truly peculiar about this country is this white race thing. Just to add on that comment, when I was coming up, I used to read in the textbooks how those Southern slaveholders, of the sort that defended slavery throughout the early 1800s and the like, would often refer to slavery as, quote, our peculiar institution, and with the no, kind of the nod and the wink almost. And Allen stands all that history on its head. And he says, no, he says, you've got it all wrong. What's the really peculiar institution in this country is this white race thing, which was created and invented here at a certain period of time, which I think we'll probably get into. But so those are some of the aspects of Allen that really appealed to me.
I'm sure there are many in the country and abroad that are not familiar with Dr. Allen's publications. Now, having said that, why would you urge people, young people in particular, to read The Invention of the White Race, Volumes 1 and 2?
I think it really speaks to people who are in struggle today and worldwide. And the reason is this: the United States is the most powerful country in the world. It is, in many ways, the major hindrance to progressive social change throughout the world, and it could play such a positive role in progressive change if it would take a different direction. And Allen's work understands the nature, I think, of this society, how the white race and white supremacy have been central in shaping it, how if we can challenge that effectively, we can move in a new direction. And what he's doing also, when he talks about the white race, and this should be emphasized, he's not talking biologically. He's talking the white race as a political creation. He writes on the back cover of the first volume, when the first Africans arrived in 1619, there were no white people there, nor would there be for another 60 years. And he said, look, people were English, they were French, they were Dutch. When John Punch, in 1640, John Punch is an African man, runs away with two other people. And John Punch attracted some attention about 3 or 4 months ago when it was pointed out that he was an ancestor of Barack Obama. Interestingly, on Barack Obama's mother's side, but he had been sentenced to a lifetime hereditary bondage in 1640. When John Punch runs away, he runs away with two other people who were bond servants. One was a Dutchman and one was a Scotsman. They were still not white. The phrase was not even in use. In Bacon's Rebellion, which is the big struggle that Allen focuses on in 1676 and 1677 in Virginia, the accounts by Thomas Grantham are quite revealing. He's the ship merchant who is instrumental in helping to put down that major rebellion. And he talks about confronting 400 Negroes and Europeans in arms, still not white. Allen explains that in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion, it was through conscious policies and continuous propaganda and extending of racial privileges based on this new white identity that was being hammered home, that this was implemented. So I think people worldwide, getting back to your question, I think people will come to appreciate how significant this is in addressing social change, both in the U.S. and in the world.
And for those who may not be aware, just briefly, what was Bacon's Rebellion?
Bacon's Rebellion was a struggle in Virginia in 1676 and 1677. It started out as a struggle over the rate of expropriation of lands from Native Americans, and that was an elite sub-elite struggle. The elite liked things as they do nowadays, just the way they are. The sub-elite wanted to move more aggressively on the land of the Native Americans, the Powhatan people in the area, because they wanted to build big plantations in the state so they could sell tobacco, grow tobacco. And it started out as a struggle like that, but so often, as so often happens in history, when there's a struggle within the elite, the people at the bottom of society come into motion. And at that time, there were about 8,000 bond laborers and many other laboring people, and they entered Bacon's Rebellion, and they started pushing the demand of those 8,000 bond laborers. And this is a history most people are not familiar with because we've been fed other things on TV and in our history books. But in the early period, through most of the 17th century, the majority of the bond laborers, those who could be bought and sold, were actually European American, not African or African American, because there wasn't a big turn to Africans till after the founding of the Royal African Company in the 1670s and a few other factors. So in Bacon's Rebellion, these people at the bottom of society rise up, they kick the governor out, they burn Jamestown, which is the capital. They control 6/7 of the land for months and months, and it takes months to put this insurrection down. And they show great solidarity. And in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion, the ruling elite realizes, well, we got to come up with a plan for social control. And social control is one of the key concepts that Allen emphasizes in his work. The subtitle of the first volume, Allen's Invention of the White Race, has two volumes. And the first volume is Racial Oppression and Social Control. And the second volume is The Origin of Racial Oppression in Anglo-America. Gary, if I may, it's probably good to just at least state clearly what Allen's main theses are in his book.
Sure.
And in the book, as I said, he points out that the white race did not exist through most of the 17th century. And he cites the status of African Americans. And African Americans had many rights in Virginia in the 17th century. And whites were not being used against African Americans, as we later came to see in the South and throughout this country. So Allen's main theses are the following. One, that the white race was invented as a ruling class social control formation in response to labor solidarity as manifested in Bacon's Rebellion. And second, that a system of racial privileges was deliberately instituted by the late 17th, early 18th century Anglo-American bourgeoisie in order to define and establish the white race and to establish a system of racial oppression. And he describes, and we can talk about this if you like, what he means by racial oppression. The third thesis of Allen is that the consequences were not only ruinous to the interests of African Americans, but they were also, quote, disastrous for European American workers whose own position vis-a-vis the rich and powerful was not improved, but was weakened by the white skin privilege system. That's a key point that Allen makes there. And of course, overriding all these three theses is that the invention of the white race was political. It had nothing to do with genetic evolution. So that's Allen's thesis overall. And he then extends it through the history, and he says that this white race thing, which is a multi-class formation, right? And so it serves the interests of the ruling class, has served as the principal historic guarantor of ruling class domination in the United States. One other thing, just on those theses from Allen, those three that I elaborated, what listeners might find of great interest is that you see those same core theses in the work of Lerone Bennett Jr., who people may be familiar with, was senior editor of Ebony magazine for many years, wrote Before the Mayflower, which had wide circulation. And one of his earlier works, which is really well worth looking at, is a volume called The Shaping of Black America. And in that book, particularly in chapter 3, The Road Not Taken, he describes 17th century Virginia in many of the same ways that Allen does. People might find that very interesting also.
Now, you recently completed an expanded edition of The Invention of the White Race.
Yes.
What additions have you made to complement or enhance the original work?
Well, thanks, Gary. Very good question. Allen left note. I'm his executor. I've got all his papers and books, which I'm inventorying, indexing, and the goal is ultimately get all his writings up online. I'll just, again, parenthetically note, the Harrison family let me do the same thing with Harrison's papers, which are a major collection, and I indexed them, inventoried, preserved them 112-page finding aid, which is freely accessible to the public up at Columbia University. But the finding aid is available online for the Harrison paper, so people might want to look at that. Now, in the new invention,
I'm sorry, where can they go? Is there a specific link that they can log on to?
yes, if you go to Columbia University and you look up Hubert H. Harrison papers, in their Clio is the catalog. It's called Clio, right? If you just go to Columbia University online, and then from Clio, they'll give you an option to hit on the finding aid. But also, I should mention now, and I'll reemphasize this later, I have a web page, www.jeffreybperry.net, which is really essentially dedicated to the work on Harrison and Allen. It's got 3 individual subpages on Harrison, 3 individual subpages on Allen. You can find the link, direct link to the 112-page inventory of Harrison's papers there. Probably the easiest way for people to find a lot of what I'm going to reference is go straight to my page. You can find 60 or 70 articles by Harrison, maybe about 20 articles by Allen. Just link on. You can download them, read them online, and you'll find references to lots of other materials. So again, www.jeffreybperry.net. Back to your question regarding the invention of the white race. So Allen left some notes and stuff, mostly typographical, relatively minor changes, corrections from his original volumes. Because he finished these, by the way, Allen was born in 1919, and the books come out in 1994 and 1997. So he's in his 70s when these books are coming out. Now, in addition to the typographical corrections, I wrote introductions to each volume describing the books and what Allen's trying to do. I wrote new back matter, which includes in each volume an internal study guide, because Allen's work, particularly the first volume, it's a difficult read for people in the U.S. to the extent that it moved beyond the borders of the U.S. And one of the points that Allen's trying to make is it's important to look at the nature of racial oppression and not be blinded by all our notions about pigmentation and skin color and things like this. So he looks at the example of the Irish in Ireland under both the Anglo-Norman domination and then later under what's called Protestant ascendancy. And he finds striking parallels with the treatment of the Irish in Ireland under Protestant ascendancy and the treatment of African Americans in the U.S., both pre and post emancipation. I think readers will find that very interesting, but it's a difficult read at first if people are not familiar. So I put in about 25-page study guides in each volume, which are good for not only the individual reader, but they're good for group discussions or for classroom use, right? They help people work through. Each chapter is kind of pulled together in 2 or 3 pages, so you can almost look at the study guide and then go back and really pour into the chapter. The other thing that I think is crucial is I greatly expanded the index, because as I mentioned earlier, Allen has this great integrity as a scholar, and he's very precise with his definitions and his concepts. And so now I think by using the index, and I in my Harrison biography, volume 1 of my Harrison biography, I had an index, I think, of 70 some odd pages too. I'm very much into trying to work with the reader so they can find whatever they want. Another reason why the expanded index is important is because approximately 35 to 40% of Allen's volumes are notes. He did such research, so he tells his story, but then he backs everything up, again, with all these primary sources and other sources that people may want to go look at and check and confirm. And that's, again, that integrity he brings to it. But using the indexes, I believe one is able better to really pursue in great depth Allen's work, which is so important. But also, Gary, I'd like to mention, besides what is done there, Allen himself, a year after he completed the second volume of The Invention of the White Race in 1997, did what he calls a summary of the invention of the white race. It's in 2 parts. It's for an online publication called Cultural Logic. It again can be reached directly from my webpage. And this summary, if you will, in 2 parts, each part is 50 pages. So it's very detailed, it's documented. And one other thing I'll just mention, besides short biographical sketches I've done and what I have on my webpage, where I have outlines of each volume on my webpage, there's also a pamphlet that Alan wrote in 1975, which was really a precursor to what was coming. And it's called Class Struggle and the Origin of Racial Slavery, the Invention of the White Race. And that is available from the Center for Study of Working Class Life, SUNY Stony Brook, in pamphlet form, but it's also available free on my webpage. And that one has a nice 12-page introduction, which lays out what Alan's work is about. And again, listeners might find that of interest.
I'd like to take what you've done with this expanded edition and apply it to a contemporary situation. And here's what I want to ask you. There are those within the white power, white nationalist movement who state that they have just as much right to express white pride and love for their culture as much as blacks, Hispanics, or any other race. Moreover, they believe they should not be called racist for adhering to their beliefs and or practices. Your response?
Well, all of my research, and particularly my familiarity with Alan makes the basic argument that there is nothing progressive in white identity, right? There is absolutely nothing progressive in white identity. And what his body of work goes to argue is that this white race thing, he refers to it as an incubus, a devil, which has to be gone after both in practice, how it functions, how it's maintained, but it has to be gone after historically and ideologically too. And that's what his work is about. So I make no defense, I offer no support for this notion of, I mean, I recognize this white race thing functions, it's real. I don't think it's biological, it's a political creation, but it serves the interests of the ruling class. I come out of a working class background. I was active in the labor movement for over 35 years. I'm very clear that this is not in my interest, and all of my work nowadays, most of the work I do, most virtually everything, tries to focus on how important it is to come to understand this and challenge it and struggle against it. So I guess that would be my response to those white supremacists and white nationalists. And I would, that would be my intellectual response.
Now, you're going to be conducting a book launch and slide presentation for the new and expanded edition. When and where will that take place?
Thank you for asking, Gary. The first book launch is going to be on this Thursday night, January 31st, 2013, at 7:30 p.m. at the Brecht Forum, 451 West Street, New York. It's in Lower Manhattan. I think people can get off at 14th Street and walk there. If they have a car, they can generally find parking in the West Side area. It's right on West Street, West Side Drive, right off the West Side Drive. So that's on January 31st, Thursday night. And already they say they're expecting a very full house. So I encourage people to get there and get there promptly. A week later, the following Thursday, there'll be another book talk at Blue Stockings Radical Bookstore and Community Center, which is down at 172 Allen Street in Lower Manhattan. On February 8th, for those seriously interested, and I think these matters of race and class are central to people who want to seriously change conditions in the United States, and we really have to come to some understanding of them. And we're going to be doing an 8-week course at the Brecht Forum on Friday nights from 7:30 to 9:30, starting on February 8th and running through March 29th. And again, that Brecht Forum is 451 West Street, but all of this is online. On my webpage, I have a list of my upcoming events. You can go to the Brecht Forum and see, it's listed there. One other thing, now I'm starting to book other talks. One of the main ones coming up is in April 7th. We're going to be down at Busboys and Poets in Washington, D.C. But other upcoming talks are in Silver Spring, Maryland. I was down in Delaware last week. And we're now arranging for down south and out west, various talks. So I encourage people to come and try and make one of these book launches and if they can do the class, because the class is going to be 2 hours, they're going to be very good sessions. I know some of the people who are already planning on coming. There's going to be some very good, very serious people taking the class, but also it's going to be Friday night, so people are going to be able to stay and talk a little later, if they want to, in the evening. And it should be a very worthwhile coming together of minds and people concerned about these crucial issues and problems.
And once again, how can people contact you for more information about the expanded edition or public speaking events?
Great. If they go to my webpage, I think that's the simplest way to do it. My webpage is www.jeffreybperry.net. On that webpage, one can find my email, which is very similar. It's jeffreybperry@gmail.com. And Jeffrey is Jeffrey, B as in boy, Perry, Perry. So jeffreybperry@gmail.com, www.jeffreybperry.net.
All right. With that said, thank you very much for joining us for this edition of the G-Man Interviews, Dr. Perry. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Gary, thank you so very, very much. I really appreciate it.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the G-Man Interviews, ladies and gentlemen. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe,